Stacy Schiff has written books about Benjamin Franklin, Cleopatra, and the Witches of Salem. And now it's Samuel Adams, a Massachusetts man Thomas Jefferson called the father of the American Revolution. Stacy Madeline Schiff was appropriately born in Adams, Massachusetts, graduated from Phillips Academy and Williams College. Samuel Adams was born in Boston and lived for 81 years from 1722 to 1803. He's also been called the most Puritan and the most populist of the American founders. If you met him before his 41st birthday, according to author Schiff, you probably wouldn't consider him much of a success. Stacy Schiff, when you were thinking about your next book, how did it all work? Where were you? When did you decide? How did you sell the idea?
It's somewhat woolly in my memory, but here's my best analysis of it. I was coming out of 5 years in Salem, Massachusetts, having written about the witch trials in 1692. And I think I was very much looking for someone who stood in the light after those very dark years, someone who took a very noble stand. I think I was thinking a lot about the people who first raised their hands and suggest that perhaps the Salem witch trials have proved some kind of miscarriage of justice, which was a very risky assertion to make at the time. So I was looking for someone who had that kind of moral fiber. It was 2016. I think we were all thinking a great deal about democracy. And I had gone back for other reasons, to my Ben Franklin book. I'd done a book about Ben Franklin's years in France, in which Samuel Adams makes a cameo. And I was, I think, somewhat appalled by my own ignorance of Samuel Adams. The more I read among his contemporaries, the more clear it was that to them, he was the founder's founder. He was, as Jefferson puts it, the most active, the earliest, the most persevering of the patriots. John Adams, Samuel's cousin, will say that the real story of the Revolution could not be written without the character of Samuel Adams. So I was sort of fumbling around thinking, why is he so preeminent to his contemporaries and so lost to us?
So how does it work? How do you start making a proposal, and how much research did you do before you went forward with it?
I thought I was researching a book on someone else, to be perfectly clear. And I went to my local library, where I tend to do the early research for every book. And there's a biography floor, which is obviously shelved alphabetically. And the woman whom I thought I was writing about, papers were to the right, and Samuel Adams's papers were to the left. And over time, I realized that I was winding up by mid-afternoon, sitting on the floor underneath the Adams papers to the left, as opposed to pulling the books off the shelf to the right, where I meant to be researching. And at a certain point, I described the situation to my agent, who is usually fairly opinionated about subjects. And he said, I don't understand. Of course, you're meant to be writing a book about Samuel Adams. Sort of, why are you hesitating here? And immediately grasped, or immediately felt that it was a fabulous idea. I was still, I think, a little uncertain, because I was uncertain as to how much documentation I would have at my disposal.
So what did you do next?
Then I did a very short proposal, which reassured me that I thought he would make for excellent company. I mean, you set off on these projects and you realize you're going to be in very close quarters with someone for 5 or 6 years. So you don't want to sign on lightly, I should say. This person, you don't necessarily have to love this person, but you do have to somehow cohabitate with him or her for five or 6 years or longer. So I did a short proposal, as much to convince my publisher as myself. And I think in the end, we were all convinced. So this is the same publisher. This is Little Brown, who also brought out Cleopatra and the Witches.
So once you've made the proposal and they like it at the publisher, how much time is there between that and when you really start serious research? And where did you go in the interim? How many places did you go to find out about Samuel Adams?
I think I don't really wait to hear from the publisher if I think we're off and running. I think I felt my agent's confidence was strong enough that I was going to be writing this book for someone, and I was thrilled to land again at Little Brown. So I started right in with the papers of Samuel Adams. which for once in my life is actually in New York City where I live. I think this is the first time that's ever happened, that I live in the town where the primary documents are housed. And that was a marvelous thing. The papers of Adams are published, but what is published is only his side of the correspondence, and not in its entirety, I should add. Whereas the collection in the New York Public Library is both sides of the correspondence. So it allows you to flesh out a great deal. It allows you to see to what he's reacting, obviously, in his letters. You get a much more personal take. His letters from his wife, for example, are in that collection, although they are not in the published edition. You get to see hints and stabs from various friends and enemies, which are in the collection. And I started there with those papers because that's really kind of ground zero, and then moved out, which is what I've done in the past, to more ancillary collections. So that meant material largely at the Massachusetts Historical Society and other Boston repositories, material that was in the Library of Congress, and then in a much sort of richer fashion, material that's in either the National Archives in London or the Parliamentary Archives in London, because those are the great repositories of letters written about Adams by the governors and lieutenant governors and the crown officials whom he so annoyed for those 15 years leading up to the revolution. So that's a particularly nuanced and colorful vision of Adams that we get from those papers. And of course, there are always heartbreaks along the way. There are always the things that you expected, from which you expected to work, that never turn up. And one of those in the archive here at the New York Public Library, I had expected to find something about which I had read, which was a 50-page memoir of Adams by his daughter, which seems to have gone missing over the years. And I had hoped to work from that to get really a sense of the man at home, of the domestic Adams. And that's something which I've never located.
Go back just for a second to the New York Society Library. The last person to mention that place to me in one of these chats was David Halberstam, who loved that place, and he'd talk about going there to do his research and help write his book. And then I saw you on a YouTube video promoting the New York Society Library, looking for, I assume, contributions. Talk about that place and why that matters so much, and what's the benefit of using that particular library?
Well, my problem as a non-academic is that I don't have immediate access to a university library. Now, that has changed now that Columbia and NYU and the New York Public Library are part of a consortium. But for years, the New York Society Library was the sole library where I had access to the stacks. And I can't stress enough, and I'm sure every other writer of nonfiction would say the same, the importance and the just general value of an open stack library. Because inevitably, you go into the library for the book you think you need, and you discover that the book you really need is the next one on the shelf, which you would never have discovered had you not made that trip yourself. And very often the research for these books is a matter of just gnawing your way through a particular shelf or set of shelves of literature, and to be able to sort of see what's there, just to quantify it and to sort of orient yourself, is just of unfathomable importance. The New York Society Library is also interesting in that, for me, in that it has a very sophisticated and, I guess, opinionated readership. Whenever you find sort of whenever you pull a book off the shelf in which someone has written in the margins, they generally do seem to have known more than the author herself knew. So sometimes that marginalia is actually really helpful. But it's an amazing place to work, and for New York City, an amazing resource.
How did the Samuel Adams papers get to the New York Society Library?
The Samuel Adams papers are in the New York Public Library.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I believe they are there because they were part of the Bancroft gift, that massive collection of American history. I'm fairly certain he had acquired them and that they made their way to that library with his gift.
So when you're looking at the papers, how big are they, and how much of those do you read?
I think biographers like anyone, biographers like to brag, and I think we brag in linear feet. My subject, I had to read my way through 20 miles of linear feet to get to the heart of the matter. There isn't, unfortunately, that much for Adams. There are shelves, but they are not massive shelves. They are There are other things that are there that are equally central to his life. For example, the Boston Committee of Correspondence papers are there, which we can talk about, and are immensely helpful in filling out around the edges. Sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought.
We were talking about the New York Public Library, the stacks.
Yeah, no, I was going to say something about, oh, I know, sorry, I was going to say, but what I normally do is to start with that primary source and those primary documents and read them once through without necessarily the context, which would entirely explain them to me. And then I sort of branch out a little bit and I go to the ancillary collections and I read the secondary materials and I begin to fill in the cast of characters. And in this case, the colonial positions and the British posturing and all of the rest of the picture. And then ultimately I go back to those original documents when, of course, they read very differently. And when things tend to jump off the page in a way they hadn't done earlier. For example, there's one letter from an individual who appears nowhere else in the Adams papers, who mentions to Samuel Adams when he's in Philadelphia at one point that he had stopped at Adams's home and essentially emptied all of the papers from the home so that they couldn't fall into the hands of the British soldiers in town who would have loved to prey upon them. And it's such an act of dedication, such an act of devotion to Adams. We don't know who this individual was. It's the only letter from him, but it's really telling. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily jump out at you until you really know the shape of the story. And this was true as much with Salem witchcraft, where I read the documents and then I spent 2 or 3 years reading around them and then ultimately went back to them a second time.
Did you go to those other places you mentioned, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Library of Congress down here, or is everything now online?
A lot of things are online. I went everywhere. I just feel I need to read the documents themselves. I don't think I'm unusual in this, the feeling that you want to sort of touch the paper that your subject touched. You want to see the primary document. You want to be able to read through what's so assiduously crossed out. There's some kind of magic, to me anyway, in actually seeing and handling the original documents wherever it's possible. So yes, and the truly, I think, greatest cache of those is probably the Public Records Office in Kew in the UK, where you have copy after copy of beleaguered customs official or royal governor writing back to London saying, I just don't know what to do about these obstreperous colonists. And these letters are often written in quadruplicate, so they turn up in different files. But there's a massive amount of just crumbling, incredibly rich and colorful material there.
A non sequitur question. Back in those days, in 1750s, 60s, 70s, did the Americans who were British citizens have an accent like the British?
It's one of the great unanswered questions. Everyone obviously is British. There are relatively few mentions, of which I'm aware, where people comment on other people's accents. We know a couple of things which I think speak to the question. We know that British officers who are sent into the countryside to spy on what the Americans might be cooking up with those munitions in Concord, those kind of British spies, when they open their mouths, nobody knows that they're British officers. So presumably everyone speaks more or less the same English. On the other hand, and we also know that there are deserters from the British Army who live undercover, so to speak, because the Americans have welcomed them very warmly and have helped them who has suborned them and helped them to leave Boston. They sort of just fit in easily in the countryside. On the other hand, we do know that there is a distinct New England accent. And we have fairly good descriptions of that, and also from the very eccentric spelling, you get a fairly good sense of it. It isn't completely distant from the Boston accent today. And there's actually a wonderful mention of Ben Franklin's when John Adams arrives in France to assist with the French alliance. Franklin talks about how it's sort of music to his ears to hear the New England accent again. So obviously John Adams is speaking a somewhat different English than were Franklin's other American associates.
You mentioned Benjamin Franklin. You did a book on that. What did you think of him after you spent so much time with him?
I'll admit that part of the reason I was rooting around in that book and thinking about Samuel Adams was that I was looking for something of an excuse to spend more time with Ben Franklin, which I would add this book did not provide. Franklin is just effortlessly good company, and I think endlessly fascinating because there are so many sides to him. So my sense of Franklin, I would happily write another book. I'd happily go back to spend 5 or 6 more years with Benjamin Franklin. I'm not sure I would feel that way about Cleopatra or any other number of people I've written about. Franklin is fascinating because whatever you say about him, you can almost say the opposite and argue both sides. I mean, he's so multidimensional and so sort of sinuous a character that I just find him endlessly entertaining.
About this time in a podcast like this, somebody's saying as they're listening, why aren't they talking more about Samuel Adams? And I would just point out that you and I chatted a couple weeks ago. We had some technical problems, but we're able to save a lot of our conversation, and that is available to anyone listening to this at the end of this discussion. Back to Samuel Adams, did you see his actual handwriting?
Yes, all of those documents are in his hand, and I think that's the other piece of, wanting to see the actual papers. You want to sort of see the pen as it's scratching its way across the page. We have a number of accounts of him writing through the night, writing tirelessly for American rights. So we know that he's like Franklin for that matter, an easy writer. He's very much at his ease on the page, less at his ease as a speaker, but very much at his ease on the page. And he's an excellent letter writer, in fact. So yes, I spent as much time as I could with those documents.
At the top of each of your 13 chapters, you have a quote from somebody. And I thought to take some time to ask you about some of these quotes and who the people are and why you chose them. I'll start with the second chapter. And the title of the chapter is A Voice in the Darkness, A Knock at the Door. And then the quote is from Thomas Hutchinson, 1779. Quote, everything in American affairs happens contrary to probability, unquote.
Well, I will admit first off that what you just called the second chapter, and which indeed appears in the book as the second chapter, was to my mind the first chapter. And that what is now the first chapter was to me an introduction. However, my publisher is of the mind that no one reads introductions, and so he renumbered the chapters. So I thought of that as the first chapter, and I thought of Thomas Hutchinson's as sort of the opening salvo, in the sense that, I wanted the book to begin with this idea that what is about to happen is just wildly improbable. And that is so much the trick, obviously, in writing history, is reinserting into it the precariousness and the accidental nature and the fragility of it all. But the fact that Thomas Hutchinson who becomes something of the anti-hero of this book, he's lieutenant governor and ultimately governor of Massachusetts, can't grasp the currents that are roiling the colony around him, is so much at the heart of what's about to happen. And the fact that this could all have happened so swiftly and so unexpectedly, to have gone from, spotlessly loyal to, as Thomas Hutchinson will see it, stark raving mad over the course of a decade, really sort of, it's mind-bendingly complicated. So I didn't want to lose sight of Hutchinson. I'm very fond of Thomas Hutchinson, despite how much of a nuisance Adams was to him. And I wanted him to have the opening shot.
What was the difference in their age?
Hutchinson, I think, is 13 years older. I think Hutchinson was born in 1711. Maybe it's less than that. They're about a decade apart. They're very similar in their backgrounds, which also I find very interesting. They're both sort of fifth generation sons of Massachusetts. Hutchinson's family has distinguished itself over the years in public service. They both go to the same schools. They both end up with master's degrees from Harvard. Hutchinson at 26 will enter the House of Representatives. He marries very well into another sort of family dynasty. He prospers financially, as Adams does not. And he becomes, by the 1760s, as Adams is kind of ambling his way toward some kind of significance, he becomes sort of the face of authority, and the face of prosperity, I should say, and the face of authority in Boston, because he has begun already to accumulate a great number of titles. And so he is kind of the anti-Adams in many ways, but he's as devoted to Massachusetts as is Adams, and he's an immensely dutiful and diligent and modest and sober and appealing man.
By the way, I pointed out in the introduction that you were born in Adams, Massachusetts, and you went to Williams College, which means that you spent a lot of time around Massachusetts. Did that have anything to do with your interest in Adams? And why do you live in New York City?
I think there is probably some obsession with the New England starchiness. I think I'm completely educated in New England. The Adams twist. There's a wonderful, wonderful writer of writing. I'm sure you know his work, named Bill Zinsser, who tried to convince me about a decade ago that I needed to write a memoir. And I think the biographer just rears at the very idea of memoir, because part of the joy of writing biography, of course, is escaping one's own life. But there was something appealing about going home in a way with Adams, Massachusetts. I was, again, mortified that I was so ignorant of Adams because I come from Adams, Massachusetts. It seemed like it was just a delightful. It was kismet in a way to be working on Samuel Adams and to know that I had not known of him all these years. It seemed somehow preordained. I think that this book, to some extent, the Franklin book and the Witches, somehow felt to me like they fell together on a continuum, a sort of New England continuum. And I sort of felt as if this was the book that took us from those Puritan years of Salem to the Enlightenment years of Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson.
I've heard you make the comment before about avoiding one's own life, but as an outsider, I don't know that much about you, but we've talked before. I see a person that's had, over a 30-year marriage, had 3 children, a lot of successful books. Why are you afraid of writing about your own life?
How many more minutes do we have? This could be a very interesting session, Mr. Lamb.
It's fine with me.
I wrote a piece once, of which I'm actually quite fond, about the difficulties of writing biography and how you think you've left yourself entirely out of the book because you've spent years, you're emptying the dishwasher, but you're really back in 18th century Paris or whatever. You've just, you've somehow time traveled as opposed to paid attention to the life at hand. And then you write the book, and then you discover that somehow, unwittingly, you've landed pieces of yourself on every single page. So I think I've escaped, but I obviously don't entirely escape. And yes, I plead guilty to a 30-some-odd-year marriage and to having indeed had 3 children.
How old are the kids? They're not kids anymore.
They're not kids anymore. 30, 31, 29, and 22. I did just inscribe this book to the 22-year-old who asked for a copy as, you're adoring an absent mother. And she called me and gave me a song and dance about why I had written "and absent." So I think that was a good sign.
And what did they do?
The 22-year-old is a senior in university, a history major, just for the record. The 28-year-old does China strategy research in DC, and the 31-year-old does real estate development in Denver.
Over the years, when you've written these other books that have gotten you a lot of awards, how much interaction do you have with these children of yours, and how interested are they along the way?
I think that for whatever reason, I've tried to keep my professional life separate from their lives. I just feel as if this shouldn't be a burden to them in any way, and where they've asked about it or wanted to read about it, obviously I've been delighted. But I just feel as if they should be allowed to make their own ways in the world and pick their own read. They're all great. They're all huge readers. So it's been a delight to me when they've decided they wanted to read a great improvisation or Cleopatra, but I haven't wanted it to get in their way.
So when they were growing up, did you create an atmosphere where they automatically started reading, or were you the one that made the suggestion?
I think they grew up noticing that if they were reading a book, they didn't have to do their chores. And that became an incredible enticement right there. I will admit that there was probably cause and effect. What's that Robert Lawson book about the mouse in Ben Franklin's hat? Ben and Me, I think it's called. It's a charming children's book in which Franklin in France, wearing his incredible marten fur hat, has also given lodging to a little mouse who lives in the hat and who is obviously the mastermind behind Franklin's dealings in France. And I may have read that book to the kids so many times that I then landed on the idea of writing a book about Franklin in France. So I may have benefited from the bedtime reading as much as they did.
For a moment, let's go back to the process. So you've talked to your agent, you move ahead, starting your research. How long did you well, let me ask first, when did the publisher say yes? How long did that take? And is there discussion about how much they're willing to pay you at that point?
There's most absolutely a discussion about how much they're willing to pay me. And the great blessing is to have an agent, so you don't have to be privy to that conversation particularly. So that's really between agent and publisher. With most books, that's, it can be a quick conversation, it can be a protracted conversation, but it's very often a conversation about what part of the world the publisher is buying rights in. For example, Cleopatra has been published in 35 foreign editions. This is an American book. So really there's only one market for this book. You could conceivably see a British edition. And actually, interestingly, the only foreign publisher so far to have licensed it is Chinese. But this is really a book about America and to be sold in the North American market. So that simplifies to some extent the deal. But I'm at that point already researching. I'm leaving that I'm leaving the negotiation really to my agent, who will check in. But it's a publisher with whom we've worked before, with an existing relationship and a happy relationship. And I'm so grateful to have a home where I feel that the books are sort of lodged together. My first 3 books are with different publishers. So that's sort of, it was a wonderful place to want to stay. And I'm delighted it worked out.
Going back to the quotes at the beginning of a chapter, the next one was the great town of Boston. And this is a Samuel Johnson quote from 1775. Security and leisure are the parents of sedition. What's the point?
Well, the interesting thing about, and I don't know why I find this endearing, but for Adams's first 4 decades, he amounts to very little. He's very well educated. He comes from an affluent background. The family falls on hard times by the time he's graduated from Harvard, but he grows up with pretty much every advantage one could have in colonial Massachusetts and does almost nothing with that. And to some extent, he is benefiting, I guess I would argue, from the fact that he's able to engage politically as he does because he has had this extraordinarily good education and he has had the security of a fairly affluent home life. So I wanted to press the point that he's able to rock the boat as he does, or have the time to rock the boat as he does, precisely because he's had every advantage. He isn't someone who's trying to scrape together a living. He will be ultimately, but he isn't born someone who's had to scrape together a living. It's a luxury to be able to think outside the box. It's a tremendous luxury to be able to sort of say, I think we can design a more perfect system. And he comes to those ideas, we know, during the years when he perhaps should have been pursuing a career, but instead he devotes himself to politics. And in fact, in the first job he takes outside of the family, he's briefly sort of apprenticed to an accounting firm run by a very popular Bostonian and a close friend of his father's. And ultimately, after not very many months, the head of that firm will say, he's a very capable young man, but all he can seem to think about is politics. And I think that's, he could not have come to that position had he not had the grounding that he had.
As you know, your quotes are from a lot of different people. Some of them, quite a few of them, are British. But in Samuel Johnson's case, where do you find these quotes? How long did that take you to do that?
They're usually, it's such a great question, Brian. They're usually things that either I've been carrying around in a notebook, and I guess this too should speak to your question about the research, which, by the way, you asked me and I didn't answer you. It usually takes me about 3.5 years to research and then about a year and a half to write. And sometimes in the course of that writing, I will have to go back into the archive or back to the library to review something that I had earlier read, or to fill in a blank where I didn't, or in the case of COVID, to go back to places that had been closed during the pandemic. I also keep a notebook, which is generally things where, I'm reading Saul Bellow and suddenly there's a quote that pertains precisely to Salem witchcraft. Or I'm reading Samuel Johnson because that's the era of Samuel Johnson, and there are several lines that pertain precisely to what's happening in the colonies. And sometimes those quotes, which I think of as kind of the stem cells of the book, are just things that help me to be able to organize my thinking, to help some of the themes to begin to ferment. And sometimes they end up as chapter titles because they pull together a chapter in some way. And I think that in many ways they are crutches for me to begin to see what shape a chapter takes, because the chapter isn't purely shaped chronologically. I like to think it's also shaped somewhat thematically.
Is there any way to answer this question? Where did you learn to write? Did you have somebody teaching you how to do it, or did you just figure it out on your own?
Like many writers, I had the mother who marks up your 5th grade paper, and so brutally so that you can barely see your own words. So I think I had a very good homegrown editor in the fact that my mother was an academic, and she felt very strongly about the written word and about the proper use of the written word. I read hungrily through my entire life, and I think that when you read like that, you end up, it helps your writing to some extent, but you end up really just caring tremendously at a sentence by sentence level about the written word. I remember the first time a teacher in high school returned a paper to me and said, have you ever considered being a writer? And being sort of thrown back on my heels by that remark, because it was something I'd really never considered. And in fact, this book, speaking of things that begin chapters, this book is dedicated to my 11th grade history teacher, who was my 11th grade U.S. history teacher, who was one of those people.
Name?
Nancy Faust Sizer.
Still with us?
She is. I'm seeing her in a few weeks.
Has she read all your books?
I've never, I think you may have read more of them than she. I've never asked her that question, Brian, but after she hears this, she may have to.
All right, 4th chapter.
I don't know that she's read this one, as a matter of fact.
The 4th chapter is The Very Honest Samuel Adams, Clerk. And the quote is from Marianne Evans, better known as George Eliot. The quote is, "The blessed work of helping the world forward happily does not wait to be done by perfect men." Why that quote? How long have you been holding out on that one?
I think I was probably reading my way through. I read a lot of Eliot during COVID, I admit it. I think I really find those first failed years so compelling. And I'm sure there's some psychological explanation for that, why I find that so endearing. But, he's not someone who's marked for greatness. And yet he achieves beyond anyone's expectation. So the fact that you have this person who is so deeply flawed, who looks like he's going to amount to a perfect failure for so many years, who's just shambling his way around Boston, very much endearing himself to the townspeople. He's clearly very, very popular. He's often called into, to adjudicate cases and to stand up for people in court and to help with people who want to draft documents. But he's not exactly a shining light for those early years. And nor will he be a shining light at the end of his life. So I just wanted to sort of highlight, I suppose, his imperfections, because the improbability of the story on both levels, so improbable that a set of disunited colonies could have managed what they managed and so quickly, and so improbable that someone of seemingly so little aptitude and so little application could prove to be this tremendously disciplined dynamo. I wanted to highlight both of those things right off.
in fairness to our listeners, let's go through quickly the background. He was born where?
He's born in Boston. Grows up in a wealthy family. He's born in 1722, so it's the 300th anniversary of his birth this year, which was another reason to finish the book on time, I might add. And he grows up in a very affluent house overlooking Boston Harbor. His father was a maltster, not a brewer. He will be sent to all the right schools, and he will go very briefly into the family business. As I said, have a somewhat checkered and undistinguished career after that. The family fortune is lost partly through his poor management and partly because of an act of parliament earlier in the early 1740s. And he will thereafter sort of have to try to find his footing, which is not an easy thing to do in Boston in those years. Boston's an economically downwardly, Boston is in a bit of an economic crisis in these years. So he's not the only one who's actually having trouble figuring out a way to support himself.
How many kids does his parents have?
They have 12, of which only a few survive. The mortality statistics for those years are really kind of astonishing. At least 12.
How many times was he married?
He's married twice. He has two children survive from the first marriage. There's a hint of a miscarriage with the second wife, but the second wife did not bear any children. So the two surviving children, the two children whom we will meet in the book, are children from the first marriage.
There's a lot about the different movements that he was involved in during those years in your book. But what political offices did he hold?
So he essentially he holds a few town offices early on. He's a market clerk, and he's a tax collector. But in the wake of the Stamp Act discussions, he will be elected to the House of Representatives. It's really that crisis that puts him center stage. And he will be elected very quickly clerk of the House of Representatives.
Now, let me just ask you this. Was it the U.S. House, or what house was it?
No. Sorry, the Massachusetts House of Representatives. This is all colony level, exactly. He will never hold federal office, in fact. And it's noted that very soon after he becomes clerk of the House, very soon after he enters the House begins to speak in a much more brusque and much more peremptory tone than it had ever taken with a royal governor before. And that is very much the voice of Samuel Adams. Did we talk about the gallery in the last time we talked?
Oh, yes, we did. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm not going to go into that, sorry.
How sick was he during his life?
He's fairly robust, but he has from an early age a tremor. And it seems to have been a tremor that, not surprisingly, was exacerbated by stress, that chiefly affected his hands and his neck. And that seems, in a few accounts, almost to have given him a sort of mystical stature. I mean, there was something sort of otherworldly about his, about the quiver. It gets significantly worse after the Revolution. And it may explain, by the way, why he's so much more comfortable on the page than in person, although we don't know that. It will get significantly worse in the 1780s when he will very quickly go from saying, I can only write a few paragraphs at a time because of the palsy in my hand, to I can't write more than a line or two, to someone else actually having to write for him. And because of that, we have a lot less of him from those years, because while the inclination to write may have been there, the ability to write had abandoned him.
How tall was he?
He seems to be of about middling stature, very muscular, barrel-chested. If you think about that amazing John Singleton Copley portrait of him, that seems to have been the stance he took, kind of ramrod straight in his bearing. John Adams leaves a very eloquent description of Samuel Adams when he rose to speak. He sort of pulled himself up to his full height and almost bounced on his toes for emphasis, and sort of held out his hand and sort of declaimed in an almost a classical fashion. But there definitely is as I say in the book, I think sort of the build of a middleweight boxer.
Who were his best friends back then? Well,
his great mentor, whose who's a few years younger, in fact, is James Otis, who's a pyrotechnic orator, had graduated from Harvard a few years before Adams, very much serves as his political mentor. It's Otis who first argues a case of writs of assistance in court. It's Otis who first, I think, gives Adams a sense of where colonial resistance might fit into the system. The two of them, it's a difficult relationship, I should add, because Otis has clearly got a touch of some kind of mania. He's a man who can speak, who can talk a blue streak, as John Adams makes clear, and ultimately will descend into some kind of madness. And Adams, who's very loyal, can often be loyal to a fault, will try very hard to integrate Otis into some of the later committees and efforts at resistance, and do everything he can to make sure that no one in any way offends his former mentor, even though he knows that Otis is very difficult company and also very unpredictable. Otis will have Tory days and Whig days, and at some point say he will defend the Stamp Act, and then he will just shred the Stamp Act. He's extremely, he's clearly maniacal. He's clearly got a touch of mania, and he's extremely fickle. And I suppose that among the other closest would be Dr. Warren, who's the person who sends Paul Revere off to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that they're likely to be arrested in 1775. And John Adams, who's a very close associate for these years. John Adams, like John Hancock, are people whom Adams himself had recruited. And in fact, it was said of Adams that if for no other reason, he would be a shining patriot for the fact that he ran a sort of informal recruiting office for the American Revolution. Whenever there was a promising young man in Boston, whenever any Harvard graduate gave a particularly compelling speech on liberty, he could be certain that he would be getting a visit from Samuel Adams.
I should admit to you, not that this is a big deal, but I've been reading The Galley, which came out some time ago. And the reason I mention this, because back in the back in your endnotes, there's a quote that I want to ask you about, but I can't tell you exactly what page it came from. And I assume you'll remember this and put it in context. I'll read it. Quote, persons who relish flattery, S.A. feared, meaning Samuel Adams feared, will forever be deceived by those who design to deceive them. I'll stop with that. Do you remember? Do you remember that?
I love that. I just, can we just stop and say how delighted I am that you're reading the endnotes? That makes every writer's day. I'm assuming that had something to do with John Hancock.
Well, let me read on some more, because it makes more sense. Samuel Adams was frankly astounded that his countrymen should install as their first elected governor someone variously described as, and here come the quotes, all caprice, incapacity, and indolence, a man of straw, a purveyor of quackery and exaggeration, a court sycophant, one of the most egregious triflers I know.
I do love the egregious trifler one, right? I think the only one missing from there is the foppish pseudo-aristocrat, which one of his own biographers calls Hancock. It's hard to find a kind word for John Hancock among, certainly among those who write about Samuel Adams, but often even among his contemporaries. The two have this extremely uneasy relationship. Adams banks very early on the fact that John Hancock, who's inherited a tremendous fortune in his late 20s, will thrill to the attention of political office, and that the opposition party will thrill to John Hancock's fortune. And so he essentially recruits Hancock and helps him to be elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. And thereafter, the two have a sort of teacher-mentor, sort of mentor-student relationship, but we will fall apart at various junctures. And it will often fall apart. Hancock is extremely thin-skinned, Samuel Adams extremely thick-skinned. And Adams will very often be in a position of having to remind John Hancock that he shouldn't be discouraged because someone said an unkind thing about him. Hancock will nurse his wounds. Adams will jump to apply salve to them. But the two most often fall out in Hancock's bids for attention. He's very, very attuned to flattery. He can't seem to get enough applause. And he becomes a sort of, he's extremely generous with the town of Boston, but he can't seem to do enough to ingratiate himself with the town of Boston. So he will bestow all kinds of things, church bells, trees, all kinds of gifts on the town of Boston, and so enjoy the attention and the gratitude that he's able to buy. And Adams rails against this. Adams has a very hard time generally with anyone who's susceptible to flattery. And John Hancock seems in many ways the worst representation of that. And the two of them will be off speaking terms at various junctures in the early 1770s. Just after the Boston Massacre, there are a few years where the resistance effort entirely stutters and stalls. Adams is still at it. No one else is. And Thomas Hutchinson very cannily detaches John Hancock from Adams to the point where Hancock says that he hopes never again to see Adams or ever speak to him again. And Hancock at that point is in part bought off by a cadet corps, a group of sort of ceremonial cadets that Hutchinson arranges for him. And John Hancock goes off and spends a lot of time ordering uniforms and ordering musical instruments for his cadets, which tells you something of the difference between the two men.
I suspect that people are listening to this saying, I'm not getting the gist of Adams like I would, and maybe we're just tricking them to go buy your book. But
yeah, I think we should just never discuss the gist of it.
No, let them go buy the book. I mean, cough it up. It's ready. But by the way, I want to ask you about that, because you have had a rollout on this book. Every major newspaper reviews, mostly all positive, everything about it. How much of that did you expect?
Oh, Brian, I don't think you ever know what to expect. I think you just go into publication season, hoping that one person out there is going to read the book, that you think you might have written. I don't think one ever knows what to expect, and I don't even think you necessarily know. I'm always fascinated by and often thrilled by the fact that readers respond to parts of the book that I wouldn't have expected them to respond to, and find things in the book that I didn't necessarily know were there. But I just think of, it's like your own family. You're the person least able to explain what the book is, or least able to actually objectively say this book works or this book doesn't work.
Can you remember some reaction that a reader has had that you were surprised about, specifically?
I think I have been thrilled by the affection for him. I mean, I felt a great tenderness always, and obviously this book grew out of tremendous admiration, which only got greater as I worked. And it's been thrilling to see that other people see it that way too, that the tenacity that Adams demonstrates here through thick and thin is something to which people is something to which people themselves, everyone is responding very warmly. So that's been great. I just think we have as with all historical events, we tend to look back at the American Revolution as a set of very measured maneuvers, one of which followed neatly after another. And obviously, it's a much more anarchic process than that. It's a messy process. And pulling it apart like this gives you a somewhat different revolution. And I think it's been great for me to have people say, I didn't know any of this, or this isn't the way I learned. I thought things proceeded directly from the Stamp Act to the Boston Tea Party. That there were 17 chapters in between was something of which I was unaware. And it's just, plotting. I started with a sort of epiphany moment of, wait a minute, we all know that Paul Revere is riding off, but which of us actually thinks about where is he riding? And to have people say, oh my goodness, I never thought about that. You've actually sort of you've cast Revere's ride in a different light. That's thrilling to me, because that's why I do this.
You mentioned earlier that some people don't read your endnotes or your footnotes. What is your experience with that? Because it looks like once you've done your book and you have to do endnotes, that's a very painful process.
I'm so glad you understand that. It's the worst. It's called special endnote hell, and it's called just take your coffee consumption and multiply by 3. I haven't figured out a way to do this. I mean, endnotes are basically, for me, the source notes. Footnotes are little bits of things on the page which fall out of or further explicate the paragraph itself. The endnotes are the source notes. And when I'm writing, I don't really want to stop and write a fully formed source note. So I leave sort of a skeletal trail for myself, which I'll pick up on later, which will become endnotes. But of course, then one day comes, and usually there are not enough days for it, where you have to flesh out those skeletal endnotes. And by that time, of course, you've amassed a tremendous amount of information, and not everything is obvious. Not everything is as obvious to you as it was at the time. And you're often sort of tracking down endnotes that you had put in a very simplified form in the book. So it is an exercise in kind of tremendous gun to the head, last minute panic, but it's also kind of thrilling because it's kind of deconstructing the book at the same time, and being able to see what actually, what straw you actually wove together to make this particular basket, for lack of a better metaphor. And of course, within those notes, you can add those little pieces of the book that your editor thought you should perhaps were not necessarily germane to the story, that you could perhaps live without, but that you absolutely want to include. So you can cheat a little by sticking those in the endnotes as well.
You quoted Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 12th chapter, this important, glorious crisis. The hero is he who is immovably centered. Why that quote?
If there's nothing else by that point in the book, if there's nothing else for which Adams seems to have distinguished himself, his sheer tenacity would seem to distinguish him. By that point, you've sort of been up and back again with this question of what resistance will add up to in the colonies. The word, I'm not even sure which chapter that is the word independence yet on the table? Really, what are we looking for? Are we looking for redress? Are we looking for resistance? Are we looking for independence? And Adams is the one sort of unrelenting voice in Massachusetts at that point. So again, that was to just draw attention to how persevering he is, even while others have either sort of fallen away or have lost interest in the cause.
Are you an Emerson fan?
I am. How about you?
Yeah, one of the best books. What was it? The Fire Next Time? What was the name? No, that was not the title of it. There was a book written years ago that I interviewed on Booknotes about Emerson. I'm not a scholar. I'm just, after all these years, I try to learn as much as I can. And I want to go back to chapter 10 with you. I shall stand alone, because I was intrigued by Thomas Carlyle's quote. No man lives without jostling and being jostled. In all ways, he has to elbow himself through the world, giving and receiving offense. Thomas Carlyle, what about him? What about that quote?
Well, I mean, leaving aside the fact that if I didn't have a book to write, I would be reading Thomas Carlyle right now. There's so much of Adams which is immensely high-minded and kind of eloquently sort of transporting, actually, intellectually. And then there's so much of Adams which is really just about lowball tactics, and not all of them necessarily commendable, but a lot of maneuvering. He obviously has this tremendous ability to change minds, but sometimes he does that in what we might consider a bullying way, and the tactics can be less than savory. So hence the Carlyle quote. I can't remember which chapter that is, but which has what happens to a writer when she's finished a book.
It's chapter 10, I shall stand alone. Yeah.
I think that's the chapter where, out of nothing, Adams has had this idea, and maybe this will speak to what the book is actually about, if you'll forgive me, has had this idea that if the colonies could only hang together a little bit more tightly, if the infringed rights of one could be understood to be the infringed rights of all, something will categorically change in the colonial relationship. And that is an idea, obviously, which is not peculiar to him, but on which he harps for many, many years. After the Boston Tea Party, when there is the question of how Massachusetts is going to react to the request that they reimburse the East India Company for the tea, he manages in this unbelievably conniving manner to turn a committee that was meant to discuss the reimbursement of the tea into a committee that is going to discuss sending men to a continental Congress. And he does that by essentially making sure that the few people in the room, and in particular the one lawyer in the room, who are opposed to the idea are kept out of the discussion. So essentially he has a committee and then he has a shadow committee. And in a very agile way, he manages to get rid of this person in particular who would have made a very strong case for reimbursing the East India Company, and manages to have a vote taken and passed to send a delegation to Philadelphia in this colleague's absence. And that's the kind of maneuvering at which he's so expert. And it's not all of it commendable, but it seemed to me that the Carlisle quote spoke directly to it.
One of my favorite footnotes, not an end note, was near the end of the book, and I want to kind of go through it and get your reaction to it. It's on page 323 of the book I'm looking at, and it starts out by, "No one spent more time afterward apportioning credit than John Adams, who early on fumed that Washington and Franklin would see all the glory and that the history of the Revolution would, quote, be one continued lie from one end to the other, unquote." I'm going to do more of that after you respond to that, but that doesn't sound too friendly.
Friendly on my part, you mean?
No, on the part of John Adams.
I mean, John Adams is, because he's a very petulant character, he's therefore immensely quotable. I mean, he never meets someone without leaving an incredibly waspish and excellent description of what that person is actually like. And he does spend more time than anyone else going back over these events, locating the various Rubicons, of which there are many in his telling, assigning credit, undermining other people who will claim credit, but essentially rewriting the Revolution as he thought it should have been written. And remember, it's John Adams who will write to Samuel later and say, those 40 years of your writing will explain the American Revolution. Everyone's going to want to read those papers. You need to collect them, because John is very aware of how essential all of this is, what essential reading this all is for posterity. And he's positioning himself for the embrace of posterity. He's preening for the future. And that is something in which Samuel absolutely refuses to engage. He never makes a gesture, so far as we know, toward accommodating John on that front. Whereas John, even from an earlier age, has been wondering how he's going to make his mark, and how is he going to be remembered, and how is he going to get out from under the shadows of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. The answer is by writing a better letter than any of the rest of them.
More from your footnote. You say Jefferson had been nowhere on the scene when James Otis launched his crusade against British overreach. Otis had electrified 1761 Boston, quote, more than Patrick Henry ever did in the whole course of his life, unquote. By 1817, Adams, that's a quote from Adams, but by 1817, Adams had settled on Hancock, Otis, and Samuel Adams as the founding triumvirate.
Well, a lot of this is the shifting back and forth over who should deserve more credit, New England or Virginia. And that's pretty much the contest in John Adams's mind. It annoys him. Much has been given to Virginia at the Continental Congress because the New Englanders are understood by the rest of the colonists to be sort of, very fanatical, fire-breathing fanatics. Whereas the Virginians who are of the same mind, seem to be somewhat more mild-mannered, and they are less prickly than was, for example, John Adams. So this will explain, as John Adams tells us, why George Washington commanded the troops, and why Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and why Richard Henry Lee proposed the Declaration of Independence, because those things were entrusted to the more moderate-seeming Virginians. But afterwards, it will be very much, in a very sort of chauvinistic way, the Adams men will very much feel as if New England was leading the charge, as in fact it was. And there's a certain clawing back that you're hearing there on John Adams's part of the supremacy of Massachusetts.
Near the end of the book, you talk about Samuel Adams collapsing when he was on the floor and I guess it's the house. I've lost my place in this. But at the end, what kind of an end was it in his life?
It's to me a very poignant end. It's as if clearly his health is suffering to some extent. He outlives his time. He lives through into his 80s, and he has lost touch really with the country that he has done so much to create. So he's out of step with it. He isn't a Federalist. He never holds national office, as we said. He's still looking back, thinking that the more modest and simple old world is where he's hoping the country is headed, whereas it's rushing on to a very mercantile and luxurious future. He's seen as something of a relic in Boston, where he's deeply respected for his courage and his nobility and his tenacity through those essential years, but where he's also seen as very much a creature of the past. And watching him fall out of step like that, and yes, at that point collapse to the floor, I find heartrending. The reason the last chapter is short is that although it's quite a long period of time, he talks about revolution. He meets with dignitaries who come to Boston. At one point, John Adams will entertain George Washington. But there's that ability to connect men and to corral thinking and to sort of just pull ideas out of the air and commit them to the page really has deserted him by those years.
What's your reaction to this period of a book where you have to go out and, I don't know if you have to, but you go out and sell it? What do you think of this, of doing all these interviews and speeches and whatnot?
Well, I love talking to Brian Lamb. Let me make that clear. I think that it's an interesting one. You've written, insofar as you are capable, you've given your best shot at it on the page. So then everything that you say about it, by definition, you're mangling your own account. So I feel as if what you really want to do is direct the reader to the page, but it's kind of a catch-22 because you can't be there without talking about it. I find it thrilling to actually speak to people who are reading the book, as I said, because you're suddenly finding that there are things in the pages that you hadn't yourself necessarily seen, and because you're sharing this person about whom you feel so passionately. But I always have the sense that I'm vaguely bungling it.
Final moment here on this.
Which you can now confirm that I've done. Go ahead.
Well, after our technical failures, I don't think you've bungled it at all. Anyway, kind of the last question of this particular segment of our conversation. If you were to put your finger on the one thing that Samuel Adams did during this revolutionary period that made the biggest difference, what was it? I
suppose I would say that this real kind of campaign of modern, civil resistance, the orations, the recruiting, the boycotts, the pickets, the extra-legal meetings. I mean, it's really sort of an astonishingly modern invention, which he creates out of whole cloth, and which utterly reorganizes, invigorates and reorganizes colonial resistance. And I think that is really almost entirely his doing, and strikingly original.
The name of the book is The Revolutionary, Samuel Adams. Our guest has been Stacy Schiff. Thank you very much for all your time.
Thank you, Brian.
Booknotes Plus is also available as a podcast. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts.